Ideas of Education, The Illimitable Freedom of the Human Mind, Thomas Jefferson's Idea of a University. Roger just wanted me to mention for a minute or two some of what was happening at Monticello and what I do. I oversee a research institute called the International Center for Jefferson Studies. It's half a mile from Monticello itself. It has connections with today's subject because the building I live in was owned, and work in rather, was owned by Pa Watson, who essentially was the informal chief of staff to Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt was in my office, what was then called the library, on the 4 days leading to D-Day, and he was meant to be in that office on D-Day, except for the fact that D-Day was delayed, but he wrote the so-called D-Day prayer, which if you've never heard it, you can Google it and listen to it, and it's like a mini Gettysburg Address. All I would say is that I can think of very few other house museums that devote so much in the way of resources to scholarship. We publish the Jefferson Papers for the retirement period. We have the first library built to a founder. We have 30 scholars on fellowships visiting each year. A third of those come from abroad. We've got a research department, an archaeology department that's really having a major impact on the methodology of archaeology. It's very impressive. Like most museums, this is a tough period because of a year essentially of having visitation numbers almost collapse for a while. They're now back up to half, but we can't, even if people turned up, we can't have them in the usual numbers in order to obey CDC guidelines. But I think relative to most places, we've come through it quite well.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you. I appreciate that. And now this week, I was trolling Facebook as as many of us do. And Andrew posted something that ironically had something to do with tonight's show. So I immediately emailed Andrew and I asked him to join us this evening. Andrew, tell us about your father's cousin, Mary O'Shaughnessy.
Well, and this is, and I should say, I'm not a Second World War expert, although interestingly, my brother's done 2 books recently on Nazi propaganda. He's called Nicholas O'Shaughnessy, and he's done one book called Selling Hitler and another called Marketing the Third Reich. But I was reading as a child, and I've always found this subject, and partly because of what I read at the age of 17, difficult to confront. And it happened that there was a book in my school library called Scourge of the Swastika, written by a man called Lord Russell of Liverpool. It was originally published in 1954. The copy I have was published in 1955, by which time there had been 11 editions. And this was the first book, despite all the evidence at the Nuremberg trials, to really tell the British public about Nazi atrocities during World War II. And that is why it became such an instantly bestseller. For many people, this was the first time that they'd heard much of this, having not followed closely the evidence presented at Nuremberg. And I was 3/4 of the way through the book, and I suddenly came across a reference to this woman, Mary O'Shaughnessy. And so I, matter-of-factly, wrote to my father and said, are we any relation to this woman? And he said, yes, she was my cousin. And it turned out that she was one of the major witnesses to testify. And some online said she testified at Nuremberg, but I know she testified at the war trials in Hamburg. But at the outset of the Second World War, she had been a nanny and governess to a family outside of Paris. And with the German occupation, she joined the French resistance and helped British airmen whose planes had crashed behind enemy lines. She helped members of the Royal Air Force to escape. There was one particular pilot who was seriously ill, and she actually spent weeks nursing him, getting him back so that he could escape. She realized that, and I think she discovered that she'd been betrayed by another member of the resistance. She was just about to leave Paris, but was taken by the Gestapo, and she was tortured for 10 consecutive days, during which she gave no evidence. She named no one and refused to yield any information. She was then sent in May 1944 from Paris to Ravensbrück, which was a concentration camp for women exclusively, the only one. It was also the only concentration camp which was not predominantly Jewish. She was Catholic. What is remarkable about this is that very few British people were sent to concentration camps. And this was exceptionally rare. But she arrived in May 1944. The conditions, of course, were horrific. The women were lined up and inspected every day. If their hair showed signs of going gray, if they seemed to be weak, they were then removed to be taken to extermination camps. And one of the stories she told in her trial was that she would stuff newspaper down the front of her skirt to pretend that she was a lot plumper and a lot fitter. About 130,000 women went through Ravensbrück, many of them on their way to other camps. 50,000 died, but mostly not in the gas chambers. They perished by other means. But towards the end of the war, the SS opened a gas chamber near Ravensbrück. It was called the Jugendlager, which literally means youth camp. And my father's cousin was moved to this and was one of the very few not to die there. It was opened close to the end of the war. 2,200 women were exterminated. As the Allies advanced on Berlin and of course into Poland, where this camp was based, they actually speeded up the number of deaths. In fact, they were so concerned to increase the momentum that they're actually throwing people straight into crematoriums and into the fires, not even bothering to gas them first. She was liberated by the Russians a few days before Hitler's death. She left the camp via Sweden and then returned after giving evidence in the war trials at Hamburg. She returned to England, where her story received a lot of publicity, especially in the Daily Mail, which is still one of the leading tabloids in England. And during that trip, she returned to her hometown of Ashton near Manchester, and she stayed with my father's family. And he says that it's very sad because although she got a lot of this publicity, some people were refusing to believe it. They said that the Germans just couldn't be that monstrous and that she must be making some of this up. And he said even they as a family felt a little embarrassed because it all seemed so exotic, so extreme that they had, they just weren't quite sure of it. But she didn't stay in England long. She went to live in Kenya. And interestingly enough, in Kenya, she saw another member of the resistance who she knew had acted as a double agent. And she was the only person in Kenya who would have known this and could have turned this other woman in. But she didn't, because she felt the person was so contrite and was suffering so much that she felt, for whatever reason, that was enough. I mean, it's interesting because she herself had not given up the names of other people, while her name had been given up, but she obviously was not in the least vindictive. She returned for a visit to England when she died. It's rather sad that she was put in a pauper's grave in Brighton. So she never benefited in any way from her story. And other than Lord Russell of Liverpool's book, this story remained pretty well unknown, but there's been a recent book on Ravensbook by Sarah Helm called Is This a Woman? And more interestingly, there's a book by John Hemingway, not spelt Hemingway, there's no G, Full Flight, A Story of Africa and Atonement. And John's book is about this woman who had acted as a double agent, Anna Sperry, but he found Mary O'Shaughnessy so interesting, he devotes a whole chapter to her. You can see him talking about his book online. There's a sort of YouTube interview. And one of the reasons I had just posted on Facebook is that the town of Ashton near Manchester has suddenly rediscovered Mary O'Shaughnessy, and they intend to commemorate her along with the Wigan Council. It's starting off in a small way with a brass plaque on a park bench, but it's clear that this will gain a lot of momentum. Britain, like America, is at war with itself over its statues and monuments. And here is someone that they can safely commemorate without any embarrassment.
So thank you, Andrew. I appreciate your telling us that story. And it's going to become so evident to you all when I now introduce you to our next guest. Gwen Strauss is an award-winning children's author, book author and poet, whose titles include Trail of Stones, The Night Shimmy, Ruth and the Green Book, The Hiding Game, and her poetry, short stories, and essays have appeared in numerous places, including the New Republic, New England Review, the Kenyon Review, the London Sunday Times, and Catapult. Her new book is called The Nine, which will be released in just a few weeks, and it's available for pre-order now. I'll be giving you that link. She lives in southern France, so she's coming to us, everybody, from France. It's 1:20 over where she is right now, where she works as the director of the Dora Maar Cultural Center, an artist in residency program, and Culture Center located in 2 historic buildings. So with that, I am very pleased to introduce you to Gwen, who will tell us her story, which is ironically similar.
Thank you so much. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this, Roger. It's a real honor. And yeah, indeed, there's a lot, I have a lot of crossovers with the story that Andrew just told with the subject of my book, The Nine, which is a story about 9 women. One of them was my great aunt, who were able to escape from a Nazi slave labor camp near the end of the war, and for 9 days crossed the front lines of Germany in search of the US troops. All of the 9 women at some point went through Ravensbrück. Most women actually who were deported to Germany went through Ravensbrück. And it was the largest concentration camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau. There's a lot of reasons why we don't know as much about Ravensbrück, but I could go into them. But I have a little PowerPoint, and so I'm going to share my screen here. I'm going to see if this works. There we go. Okay. What I thought I would try to talk about today, instead of telling the story of the book itself, because I want to encourage people to read it, I'm going to talk more about how I came to the story and how since I'm not a historian, sort of my path of uncovering these 9 women and their identities and how they did what they did. The story began really with my great aunt, Hélène Podliaski. That's her. She was in 2002, I was having lunch with her, and she told me this story over lunch about how she was in the resistance 60 years earlier, because she was 83 at the time. So when she was 23, she joined the resistance. And she was arrested and also tortured by the Gestapo and went to a series of French prisons, and then finally deported to Germany, to Ravensbrück, and then later to a slave camp in Leipzig, where she then led an escape of with 8 other women from that camp, really from the death march. She told me the story. I asked if I could record it because it was so astonishing, and also because she never really told the story before, or at least not to many people. And so we did it. She agreed. I recorded it, and with my other aunt Eva, we did a transcript and sort of left it at that. But then 2 years later, this other book came out. The book was called Neuf jeunes filles qui voulaient pas mourir, 9 young women who didn't want to die, written by the woman named Suzanne Maudet, or Zaza. And the account seemed so much like the story that my aunt had told me. It was kind of shocking. And so I showed it to her, and she said, yes, indeed, that was her. Because when my aunt told me her story, she couldn't remember any of the names of the other people. And I didn't know that her name, her nom de guerre was Christine, which is the name she used, she's recognized in the book. Zaza wrote her book about the escape immediately afterwards. And then it wasn't published until her death, until 10 years after, or 20 years after her death in 2004. Zaza wrote an account just about the escape, not really about what happened before or after or anything, and only tells the names of the women, their nicknames. So still, again, I didn't have their full names, but now I knew another person, this woman, Zaza, Suzanne Maudet, who was my aunt's friend and who they were deported together, and they had been friends in lycée. And then in 2010, there were 2 Dutch filmmakers, Jetski Spanier and Anja Wijdberdink. I'm probably not good at the Dutch pronunciation, Tim, who made a short documentary about Lon, because in the group of 9 women, there were 6 French women, 2 Dutch women, and 1 Spaniard. And Lon was one of the Dutch women who had written a book called a book about her war experience and a little bit about the escape. And they made this documentary where Hélène and Lon actually meet each other after 65 years. Lon had traveled to Paris to join the Dutch network in Paris with her best friend Gigi. They walked right into a trap. The whole network had been betrayed, and a few days later they were arrested. So she was in the resistance for really a few seconds, which is not the same as Nicole Clarence, who was quite important in the resistance. After the documentary came out, there was a symposium, and in that symposium, I discovered Nicole Clarence was one of the other women in the 9. And she had written an article for Elle magazine in 1965 describing the same story, it was the 20th anniversary of the liberation. And And she was telling her story of being in the resistance. Nicole was she joined in 1943 and she was 20, but very soon she became the head of all the agents de liaison in the whole Paris region. And she was arrested in August of 1944. For those who know the sort of the chronology of World War II, that's right when Paris is about to be liberated by the Allies. She was taken to a Gestapo black site on Rue de la Pompe, and it was quite a sad story because she could hear the Allies, she could hear the bombs, she could hear the city about to be liberated, but instead she was deported on the last transport out of Paris, just as Paris was being liberated, which made her one of the 57,000. And that was the name that they gave to the women who arrived from the last transport, because when they arrived in Ravensbrück, the number they were given started with 57. So instead of being liberated, she was going to be in prison for the next 9 to 10 months. In the research that I was able to find about Nicole later, I found that she had given 2.5 hours of oral history. And that was just, I found that record at the American University of Paris, and that was a huge help for someone like who's, just discovering this story. So at that point, I had 4 women's points of view. I knew Lon's point of view, I had Hélène, I heard Zaza and Nicole, and I was trying to think of how I could maybe retrace their steps and figure out more about this story. Zaza begins her book with the Death March, which is the moment near the end of the war, the last months of the war, when the German army is sort of collapsing and the Russians are coming from one side and the Allies from the other side. And the Germans had a rule that they wanted to empty the camps ahead of the Allies. So they would throw these prisoners onto the roads with no food, no water, no plan really, and march them. It was really a deadly time. About 1/3 of the prisoners died, any one of the survivors died during these death marches. They were chaotic. There were many mass executions. The women knew about the death marches because they had a group of women who had come from Auschwitz on a death march to where they were in Leipzig, and had heard from them how horrific it was. So they knew that they had no choice. They had to try to escape, or they were going to be killed probably in a field or die of starvation and hunger. So I decided with my oldest daughter, Sophie, to try to retrace their steps. Like I said, I knew that they all had been in Ravensbrück, and from there they had been selected for forced labor at an ammunition factory in Leipzig, and where they were making Panzerfaust bazookas, German bazookas. They were really successful in sabotaging them, by the way, but that's in my book, you'll have to read it. In April of 1945, they start the death march. They escape near Auschwitz. So the first 60 kilometers from Leipzig to Auschwitz, they walked almost nonstop. And you have to really imagine, one of them had diphtheria, another one had pneumonia, another one had tuberculosis. They had broken feet, broken hands, they were starving. It was quite horrific. After they escaped in Auschwitz, they traveled through these little villages until they found the US soldiers in Colditz. My book talks a lot about just what happened day to day, and that's the structure of the story that I tell in the novel, in the book. But when I was still trying to figure out who these women were, because I didn't know their names or anything, the archivist at the Leipzig Memorial Museum gave me this list. And on this list was finally Hélène's name as Christine Podliaski. It turns out that the Nazis knew her under her nom de guerre, Christine, and not Hélène. Someone else had written Hélène in the margins. There was Zaza's name right above her, Suzanne Maudet, misspelled. And there was Lon just a little bit further up. And then there was, I thought, well, this could be Josée down below. And then I saw there was the Gigi. That had to be the Gigi that was Lon's friend. So, and I poured over this list because there was a lot of information and then a lot of other people I could kind of look and try to figure out. And I was searching for the ones I still didn't know. So I decided, even though I'm not a historian, I was going to go to an archive. It's the first time I've ever been to an archive, and it was a huge discovery. And I think I had beginner's luck, because since then I've been to many archives and you can spend the whole day there and find nothing. But on this day, I discovered this wonderful woman named Odette Pilpol, and she deserves a whole book. But what was astonishing about her, not only what she did before in the resistance, but after, in her imprisonment, was she continued to keep records and note everything and write everything down. And she made lists, and she was basically bearing witness. And when all the women were forced out on the death march, she stayed behind with the people in the infirmary who couldn't walk. She did this even though the rumor was that the whole camp was going to be blown up, that it was ringed with explosives so that if you stayed behind, you would die. But she stayed behind because she wanted to steal the Nazi papers that she could find. And what she did is she stole this list. Suddenly in the archive, I found the original list, and she's the one that wrote Hélène. It's her handwriting. So she knew my aunt. That list is 150 pages and was incredibly important for so many families searching for their loved ones after the war. And she's one of the righteous. Here's some more of her lists that she made. And from those lists, I was able to find a few more of the women in my group, such as Jacqueline Aubery du Boulley. I found that she came as one of the 57,000 with Nicole. And the reason I hadn't been able to find her before was she came later. They came in September, and only was noted by Odette's handwritten notes that there was this group that came after the rest of them. Because I was able to find her and her full name, I found her family, I was able to talk to them, found out that she had diphtheria during the whole escape, and something about her life afterwards. I also was able to confirm the Spanish one in the group, who was Josée Bordonava. She was the youngest, and she had apparently a very beautiful singing voice, which the women talked about in the different accounts. And then I found the same thing in her military records, they mention it. She probably started the resistance quite young, foster home where she was raised, that was part of the Monticello network hiding Jewish children. Unfortunately, I don't know that much about her afterwards because I haven't been able to find a relative. In fact, I could have just kept researching this book forever, but at some point I had to start writing it. So she's one of the ones I hope someday to find more about. I found Guigui through the wonders of genealogy websites, and I met her family and became quite close to her family. She's the other Dutch woman in the group from a very aristocratic Dutch family. She married a Dutchman who was a survivor of Mauthausen, and her family led me to another person who I never would have been able to find, except for it was Mena, who was Guigui's best friend. And I wouldn't have been able to find her because Mena was a name she just chose out of the blue. Her real name was Yvonne Le Guillou. She was a working class girl from Brittany. She said that she joined the resistance because she fell in love with a boy, and that she wouldn't have done it if she'd known what was ahead of her. But and she never talked about the war except with her daughter, and her daughter told her son, who told me the stories. She made a quilt from the coat that she wore during the escape that she gave to her baby and then to her grandson. And the final story, the final kind of discovery for me as I was trying to figure out who these women were and find out their full stories, is Zinka, whose real name is Renée Lebon. It was hard to find her because she married someone named Lebon, so the names were all confusing for me. She joined the resistance in October 1940, which is very early. It's because her family were Gaullist. Her father was a friend of de Gaulle. She had a brother who died in Bir Hakeim, another brother who was deported to Buchenwald. Her sister went with her to Ravensbrück. And she is also, Andrew, involved with helping down British airmen through Paris and then to the border to Spain and to try to get back to England. Her husband was arrested, and she went to the prison where he was in Fresnes in August of 43 to tell him that she was pregnant. And then she was arrested because she was on a list. They kept her in prison so she could give birth to a baby girl named France. That she kept the baby for 18 days, and then the baby was taken away, and Zinka was deported to the camps. So since the beginning of the project, I thought I was sure that France was alive, or I thought she could be alive, and it would be wonderful if I could find her. And I was finally, I successfully, from all kinds of coincidences, found France, and there she was. And finding her was kind of this epiphany for me, because I realized that these stories were really important. When I met her, she and I sort of started to cry when we saw each other. And I said, you can't believe how long I've been looking for you. And she said, imagine me, it's been 70 years. And I found out all this stuff about my mother. So what I realized while I was doing this work is that these women kept quiet about their role in the resistance. And there was, like you said, Andrew, there was almost a kind of shameful thing about it. If marriages were called off, if they found out the woman was a camp survivor. De Gaulle asked women to step back and let the men take the glory because they had been humiliated. And also what the women did wasn't valued. And this I really read in Tim's book, you know, these women were 20s, they were young, they were pretty, and they were really kind of laughed at. They were kind of, it was sort of a joke. Because of that, they were able to do a lot because they could slip through the, you know, the Germans didn't expect that much from them. But in fact, afterwards, they were not valued. Later in life, like with my great aunt, as the women got older, I think they realized that they would be forgotten, but more importantly, the women who had not survived would be forgotten. And many of them began to speak up, certainly when there was a lot of, when there started to be Holocaust deniers in France. There was a big outcry at that point. So that's the story of the 9, and the story in my book is the story of these 9 women and how they resisted, how they befriended each other, how they helped each other survive, and all that kind of thing. There we go. So there's my story.
Well, that's just terrific. Thank you so much. I appreciate it's fascinating, obviously, you know, listening to remarkable stories like this, and also to be able to sort of hear you go through the process of what you went through to be able to tell the story. Our next guest is Tim Brady, who is an award-winning author whose books His Father's Son, The Life of General Teddy Roosevelt Jr., 12 Desperate Miles, The Death of San Pedro, and now 3 Ordinary Girls, the remarkable story of 3 Dutch teenagers who became spies, saboteurs, and Nazi assassins, World War II heroes, have received acclaim. He has contributed to the PBS history documentaries and has written for a wide array of magazines. He lives in St. Paul, Minnesota, as a graduate of the University of Wisconsin and the Iowa Writers Workshop. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce you to Tim Brady.
I'm going to try this sharing screen thing as well, and let's hope it works. Can you see that?
Yep, we're good.
All right, very good. Let me put a quick plug in for Gwen's book, and I might as well. I see Alex on the screen too. Alex is a wonderful writer. I've known his work for many years. But Gwen is. I read Gwen's book prior to this program, and it's really a remarkable story. It's not only deeply researched, but handling multiple narratives. Any writer knows how difficult that can be, but she does it with plum and makes a never loses the compelling nature of the story as she switches gears and switches characters. I'm going to talk. I'm going to do a little introduction to my book, which is the sort of long-winded subtitle that Roger mentioned. Is I just meant to capture every possible aspect of the selling points of the book, but it's also what makes it interesting is it is in fact true. This is 3 Ordinary Girls is the story of 3 young women who became fighters in the Dutch resistance after the German invasion of the Netherlands. I call them ordinary, but I don't mean that they weren't individual, that they didn't have their own unique characteristics, quirks, likes, and dislikes. What I want to suggest is how drastic were the changes about to overcome them. In a matter of months, these young women whose daily lives were typical for young people in North Holland at the start of the German occupation were about to become integral members of the Dutch resistance and ultimately assassins. They would begin to risk everything they loved and cherished. They would be risking their freedom, their families, their very lives for causes that had been largely theoretical to them a few months earlier. Understanding just how this happened and why was the chief animating force behind the book, and in the end became the story itself. 2 of the girls were teenage sisters from Haarlem, a city not far from Amsterdam in North Holland. Truus, the older of the 2, was just 16 years old and at the time of the invasion. Freddie, her younger sister on the left here, was just 14. The two had grown up in a working class, politically active household in Haarlem. The father left the family when the girls were quite young, leaving them with their mother, Treintje, a strong-willed, independent woman, an active member of the local Communist Party. The family experienced the hardships of the Great Depression as the girls grew up, periodically going on the dole to make ends meet. Their education and social lives were wrapped up in the political leanings of their mother, whose friends and acquaintances were largely members of the party. The girls went to summer camp. Whoops, I'm going to go back here. I can. Yep. The girls went to summer camps with the children of other leftists. They read inspirational stories of life in the Soviet Union. From an early age, helped Treintje distribute party newspapers and flyers. The family was also part of a communist-founded organization called Red Aid, which assisted refugees from political oppression. As early as 1934, they took in individuals and families from Hitler's Germany, both communists and Jews. The girls were fiercely anti-fascist and fiercely anti-Nazi long before the Germans crossed the border into the Netherlands. The third ordinary girl, Hannie Schaaf, was born in 1920, which made her a few years older than the sisters. She too was raised in Haarlem, but had no connections with the Overstegen family prior to the war. The parents were Peter and Aftra Schaaf. Peter was a teacher at an academy in the city, and like the Overstegens, had a strong attraction to socialist politics. He wrote newspapers and articles for Dutch socialist newspapers. The Schaafs had an older daughter, Annie. Annie is here. This is Hannie. Annie died during an outbreak of diphtheria when Hannie was just 5 years old. With the death of this oldest girl, the Schaafs became extremely protective of Hannie. The friends and relatives recall her being bundled in layer upon layer of clothing, even in mild weather, to protect her against chills. Hannie's most distinguishing feature was a flowing head of red hair. It made her conspicuous among her schoolmates. She was both teased and admired for the mane. Red hair would distinguish her for all her days, even the Nazis would one day pursue her. Hannie was a good student with a particular interest, like her father, in progressive history. When it came time to go off to college, Hannie chose to attend the University of Amsterdam to study law. In Amsterdam, she met new friends and almost immediately began to feel a sense of freedom beyond her parents' helicoptering style. She soon moved into an apartment, helped found a club of politically like-minded female friends, including 2 Jewish girls who would quickly become among her closest acquaintances. She volunteered to collect donations for refugees from the Civil War in Spain, and when Germany invaded Poland in the fall of 1939, she sent Red Cross parcels to Polish soldiers captured by the invaders. When the Germans arrived in the Netherlands in 1940, the Dutch were ill prepared for the invasion. They had escaped brutality of the First World War by declaring their neutrality early in the conflict. Germany had bypassed the country on its way to Belgium and France, and the hope was that they would do so again in the Second War. It didn't happen. Just 5 days after the Wehrmacht crossed the border, the country was theirs. The Queen and the government of the Dutch Republic fled to London. The army surrendered, and in the final act of brutality, the Germans bombed the city of Rotterdam when the Dutch failed to sign their terms of surrender quickly enough. The devastation of Rotterdam was the first indicator of what the air power of the German Luftwaffe could do to a modern European city in war. And it was a real object lesson to the people of London and England, because this was just weeks and months before the London Blitz, and when it gave them a horrible sense of what awaited them. So this Rotterdam was sort of a telling moment in the early days of the war. The Germans quickly established an occupying government in the Netherlands, headed by a bland Nazi bureaucrat named Arthur Seyss-Inquart. The Nazis tried to put a friendly face on the occupation at the start, expressing the hope that their Dutch cousins would come to see the wisdom of fascist governance. Soon enough, however, the oppressions of the new regime were revealed, beginning, as it usually did with the Nazis, with restrictions on the Jewish population of the Netherlands. Bans on Jews holding any public office became bans on Jews in restaurants, movie theaters, and public parks. The registry of Jews followed, and soon after, rough groups of native Dutch fascists began to bully and intimidate Jews in the streets. Inevitably, there was a murderous fight, and one of the fascists was killed in a melee. He was immediately turned into a martyr by the occupiers, who cordoned off the Jewish sector of Amsterdam, rounded up 425 Jews, and sent them off to concentration camps. This treatment of its Jewish citizenry genuinely shocked the Dutch people, who had obviously known of the Gestapo treatment of Jews in Germany and Eastern Europe, but somehow assumed that they wouldn't be so murderous to Dutch Jews. To protest what was being done, communist laborers organized a strike in February 1941, which would have the distinction of being the only strike in a German-occupied country prompted by the treatment of Jews in all of Europe during World War II. The response of the right was predictable. Mass arrests, roundups to the camps, and executions followed. The uprising was quickly quelled, and the general populace returned to a deeply intimidated town. For some, however, including the 3 ordinary girls, these actions prompted an altogether different response. It wasn't immediate. They didn't all at once decide to tuck pistols into their overcoats and go looking for SS officers. But in time, they would join a growing resistance. They would steal ID documents from the pockets of German soldiers. This is by the way, one of the things that they did. Truce, the older sister, is on the left, and Mrs. Hani on the right. Truce would put her hair up under her cap, and these two would go out on their bicycles, which are an essential element to not only to their work as saboteurs and resistance fighters, but anyone who knows the Netherlands knows how central bicycles are to the culture there. And so they were constantly on their bicycles. They would ride together in double, pretending to be a couple. That's an image of Truce, fixing the bike, which was because of its importance, and because of the difficulty of getting parts in World War II. It was central to have a bicycle to get around, and so finding spare parts and rubber was crucially important. The girls would steal ID documents from pockets of German soldiers. They would continue to distribute banned newspapers. They would bicycle around North Holland, spying on construction of German batteries and missile sites. This is a blueprint of a V2 missile rocket. It's one of their assignments. They were sent along the North Sea coast in the latter days of the war, looking for sites. One was in the town of Wassenaar, which is right outside of The Hague, and that was actually the site of the first launching of the V2 assault in London in early September 1944. They would look for construction of German batteries and missile sites. They would disguise themselves as Red Cross nurses to help transport Jewish refugees from harm's way to safe locations. They would transport weapons between resistance cells. They would place bombs at power plants and sabotage German trains trying to haul Dutch belongings from Holland to Germany. There was one more fact to the resistance that would distinguish the 3 girls in a remarkable way. They would ultimately lay in wait as potential Nazi targets came into range, and they would pedal their bicycles after them and shoot to kill both German soldiers and Dutch collaborators who were deemed traitors to the country. This last item is a distinction that should stand out. In Western Europe during World War II, thousands of women participated in acts of resistance against the Nazis on a daily basis. But the number of women, let alone teenagers, who actually picked up weapons and fired at the enemy, it's just a fraction of a fraction. These girls were anything but ordinary. That's it.
Well, that's excellent. I appreciate that. This is just fascinating stuff that we're learning here. So our final guest this evening is Alex Kershaw. Alex attended University College of Oxford, where he studied politics, philosophy, and economics, and taught history before he became a journalist. Alex is the best-selling author of books such as The Bedford Boys, The Longest Winter, about the Battle of the Bulge, and The Liberator, which was recently a Netflix adaptation, and a fascinating story about the 157th Infantry Regiment. Just an incredible narrative. I asked Alex to join us tonight for another one of his books called The Avenue of Spies, which was itself a New York Times bestseller. And it tells us a lot about what happened in Paris, very similar to the storyline that we're working with our other two books here. So I'm very pleased to introduce you to Alex Kershaw. Alex?
How are you?
Great, thanks.
How's Gwen doing? Is she still with us, or is Gwen still around?
She is still here, and there she is. She turned her camera off, but I think she's.
I'm right here.
Hi, Gwen. I think we have a very nice mutual friend, Nina. But I'm feeling for you right now because in France it's what, almost 3 o'clock in the morning.
No, it's almost 2. I got the time.
Oh, okay.
Wrong. So it's not that late.
Well, I'm gonna.
I used to live in Savannah. I wanted to tell you.
Sorry.
I used to live in Savannah. Anyway.
Oh, you did? Oh,
yeah,
great.
Yeah.
Lucky you. Okay, so I'm going to make mine as short as possible. Short and sweet. Wait, bear with me. Good evening, everyone. Okay, can you see this one? Can everyone see this?
Yep, we're good.
Yeah, okay, so this is, my book is called Avenue of Spies. It takes place in Paris during World War II, and here you have two of the key characters, two of the three main characters. There's Dr. Sumner Jackson on my left, the older guy, and then there's Philip Jackson, his son, his only son. This is actually taken in the front garden of number 11 Avenue Foch. Sumner Jackson was a highly decorated World War I surgeon, and he married a woman called Toquette, who was Swiss-French, and found himself as the head doctor, the senior physician at the American hospital in Paris in 1940 when the Germans occupied Paris. And he and his wife, and eventually Philip there, actually became members of the French resistance. So the story is really a cat and mouse narrative. They lived at number 11, but Avenue Foch during the occupation was the base for most of the SS, certainly the most murderous of the Gestapo, and several addresses on Avenue Foch became the last place you'd want to be seen anywhere near if you belonged to the French resistance. And yet at number 11, you had this American family who were actively involved from 1943 onwards, certainly in a French resistance network. And Sumner Jackson, as early as 1941, was active in an escape line that ferried down British pilots at first, and then eventually American pilots via the American hospital to down through southern France, across the Pyrenees, etc. So let's see what, here we have a really famous shot of Hitler. This is, I think, the 24th of June, 1940. Hitler only visited Paris once. He was only there for about 4 hours, arrived around 6:30 in the morning. To his right there is Arno Breker, his favorite sculptor, who created these sort of monstrous fascist sculptures of Superman, but was a favorite of Hitler's. And then to the left, you might be able to recognize Hitler's other favorite artist, Albert Speer, probably the most amoral of the men that weren't executed after the Nuremberg war trials. Very lucky that he got away with that. But anyway, when Hitler visited Paris, he said that I wanted to be there with my artists. Actually, without digressing too much, in early May of 1940, Hitler said, I will be in Paris in 6 weeks with my artists. And everybody thought he was, in the Wehrmacht, including everywhere else, thought he was overstating the case. In fact, you'd have to say that he was crazy to predict that within 6 weeks he would be able to conquer Belgium, Luxembourg, and then the whole of France. Not the whole of France, but would defeat the French. And amazingly, he was true to his word. It took around 6 weeks for France to fall that fatal spring of 1940. And here he is with his two favorite artists, who gave him a whirlwind tour of Paris on the morning of the 24th of June, 1940. He actually traveled along the Avenue Foch for around about halfway down the avenue, passing the Jackson home. But he thought the Avenue Foch was far too bourgeois and didn't suit his artistic taste at all. So he took a shortcut and didn't finish the entire tour of the avenue. Speeding up here, that's a very famous shot of the Germans on the 14th of June, 1940, when they paraded along the Avenue Foch. That's actually on the Avenue Foch. And there you have the Arc de Triomphe behind them. So iconic shot of the Nazis in Paris. Hard to overstate the psychological impact of defeat in France. The country, contrary to myth, there were very, very few people who joined the resistance in certainly 1940 or 1941. I think Gwen pointed out that those who were most active very early on were very strong Gaullists. They were either related to or were very strong supporters of de Gaulle. Sumner Jackson and his wife, Toquette, who you'll see there on the right, they were both strong supporters of de Gaulle. But it wasn't until really summer of 1943 that you started to see really active resistance in France and certainly in Paris. And by the late fall of 1943, the Gestapo in Paris, based at number 72 and number 84 Avenue Foch, under the command of a guy called Helmut Nocken, the French resistance became their main enemy, their main concern. And in the run-up to D-Day, June the 6th, 1944, the SS, the Gestapo, the Germans certainly knew that we were coming. They didn't know exactly where or when, but they knew that an invasion was imminent. And therefore, they did everything they could to destroy any possible French aid to the Allies. And that basically meant the terrorists who belonged to the French resistance. So by the early spring of 1944, Avenue Foch, the lights were on every night. The SS and Gestapo were very, very busy indeed, rounding up very successfully a lot of British agents that belonged to SOE, and in particular the Circuit Prosper, and murdering and killing and and doing whatever they could to terrify the French into doing absolutely nothing when the Allies arrived. The Jacksons were betrayed. A list of agents that belonged to the Redondo network that they belonged to was found in southern France, and it was a very amateurish operation, unfortunately, and they actually left a list of agents, and on that list was the name of Toquette Mademoiselle Jackson, who you see there on the right, as I pointed out. The Jacksons were arrested by the French, who worked hand in glove. The French police worked hand in glove with the SS throughout the occupation. Notoriously, in July of 1942, during the Grand Raffle, over 10,000 French policemen helped round up the Jews in Paris and had them deported. Most of them going to Auschwitz. Of the children that were deported, there were several thousand, not one returned to Paris after the war. And in May of 1944, there was a knock on the door at number 11 Avenue Foch. Toquette Jackson answered it, and she and Philip, who was then 15 years old, they were both arrested. Sumner Jackson was arrested at the American hospital in Paris, where remarkably, even though he was an American, he was allowed to continue to head up operations. They were taken to Vichy. They were interrogated by the Gestapo in Vichy, and then Sumner Jackson and his son Philip were separated from Toquette. Sumner and Philip were sent to Neuengamme, and Toquette was deported from Paris on the 10th of August 1944, just 10 days before the Allies liberated Paris. So close, but so far she could actually hear the sound of Allied guns in the distance, far distance. She was deported with around 200 women, and that deportation group included some of France's most revered resistants, including the niece of General de Gaulle. Violette Szabo shared the very famous British SOE agent, Violette Szabo. The movie Carve a Name in Pride was based on Violette Szabo's true story. Violette Szabo was in the same transport, the same carriage as Toquette Jackson. And they were sent to Ravensbrück. We've mentioned that already earlier on. I think Gwen mentioned Ravensbrück. It was the camp it was an all-female camp in the Third Reich. There were other camps where women were kept, but that was exclusive of women. Anyway, very long, terrible ordeal that winter. Toquette was the oldest woman by at least 10 years to be deported from Paris in her transport. In this picture, she's, I believe, 57 years old. And she spent most of the winter of 1944-45 working outdoors in summer clothing, as did her compatriots. Many of them died through exposure and frostbite and malnutrition. But somehow Toquette survived, but only just. The Swiss Red Cross managed to get her out of Ravensbrück and evacuate women from Ravensbrück in late April, almost a couple of weeks away now, of 1945. They were placed on a boat from northern Germany and taken to Malmö. This picture actually is a picture of the women coming off a boat in Malmö in Sweden on I believe, the 25th of April, 1945. And you can see there in Toquette's eyes and the eyes of these women, some of the hardship, the unimaginable hardship that they had endured during that last terrible winter of the Third Reich. Toquette was very seriously ill. It's amazing that she was able to even stand. She had thousands of lice bites all around her neck. Those were scars that remained with her for the rest of her life. She was suffering from jaundice, and in a Red Cross report that I found, basically they said that if she'd hadn't been taken out by the Red Cross, if she had stayed in Ravensbrück for even another week, she would have died. So she was literally rescued at the 11th hour. And the fate of her husband and her son was unknown. When she arrived in Malmo, she didn't know whether her husband and her only son, Philip, had survived. They'd both been sent to Neuengamme, which is in a camp not far from Hamburg in northern Germany. Sumner Jackson tragically died. He drowned in Thielbeck Bay on the 3rd of May, just 4 days from the end of the war. The RAF sank 3 ships in Lübeck Harbor and literally killed more than 5,000 concentration camp survivors who were on 3 ships that were about to leave Thielbeck Harbor. It was the largest naval disaster of World War II. Literally on one boat, more than 2,500 people were killed. The boat that Philip and his father found themselves on, that was sunk too by the RAF. The RAF were under orders to sink anything that was afloat in the Baltic, to shoot and kill anything that moved in Germany by that stage of the war. People tend to forget just how ruthlessly vicious the hatred of the Germans was among many ordinary pilots and service members among the Allies. There was not a lot of leniency, not a lot of mercy shown. And the ship that Sumner Jackson and Philip found themselves on, as I said, was hit. And of 2,000 people on that ship, there were less than 200 survivors. Sumner Jackson drowned, and his son Philip was able to somehow to swim to safety. He was picked up by the SS, who thought he was. They picked him up anyway, and then he was taken to a beach near Dielbeck, lined up against the wall, and literally he told me that he was standing there naked with dozens of other survivors from the sinkings, and they could hear the sound of British tanks, and the SS who had trained machine guns on him, they decided to flee wisely, and he lived. He returned to Paris in the fall of 1945, and he told me that he got off the metro at L'Étoile, which is the Arc de Triomphe metro stop, and walked along the Avenue Foch. I went to number 11, knocked on the front door at number 11, and his mum opened the door. And I said that, what happened? And he basically broke down when I was trying to interview him, and said, we basically just hugged for an awful long time. And he went into his room. By now he was almost 18 years old, but felt like an 80-year-old because of what he'd witnessed in Neuengamme. And he went into his room where he'd spent a very idyllic, very privileged childhood, and his mother had left everything just as it was when they'd been arrested in 1944. Not a thing had been moved. Rounding up quickly, there's Philip. There's my book there. That's taken in front of Les Invalides. Napoleon's tomb is just behind his daughter's head. That's Philip's daughter, who actually lives in Boston, Massachusetts. And there's Philip, who I interviewed at quite some length. He sadly passed away 5 years ago, but he became a very highly decorated member of the French resistance. He received the Légion d'honneur, received the highest decoration that you can receive if you belong to that august organization. And I managed to interview him several times while he was in Les Invalides, which is not only a military museum, but it's also a hospital. And it was actually on the 3rd floor of the hospital wing of Les Invalides. And at the time when I interviewed him, which was 2013, 14, there was still about a dozen survivors from the Second World War, a dozen members of the French resistance who were treated as you can imagine, national heroes still, even in the even today. Those few that are still alive are gods in France. They are the conscience of the nation, those among the many millions who actually did something to resist Nazism. The very, very few, I should say, in France joined the resistance, far less than 5%. It's a myth that everybody's uncle, aunt, and everybody joined the resistance. They didn't. It was only late in the war, when the Allies were set to be victorious, that you saw real numbers emerge of French resistance. And even then, it was very, very small number indeed. Here's a picture of Helmut Nocken, who was the head of the Gestapo, who lived at number 72, who was their most lethal neighbor. And this is him in his grand old age. So this is a man that is responsible for the deaths of at least 100,000 French citizens, maybe 50,000 French Jews, and as many French resistants. He became the head of the Gestapo in Paris in 1943 and did a superb job. He was just 36 years old when he took over SS affairs in Paris, and became the ultimate capo, the ultimate godfather, the ultimate gangster. Ran all kinds of extortion, assassination squads, you name it. He was the man that pulled all the strings in France by early 1944. Was tried by the French, tried by us, the British, for various political reasons. Was not executed. Spent around 10 years in jail, and by the 1960s, late 1960s, was enjoying a second career as a very successful insurance salesman. And this is taken in the this photograph's taken in the early 90s. He was asked towards the end of his life, I think he was unbelievably, he was in his late 90s when he died. So he had a very, very long life indeed, one that was not deserved in any way. He epitomized the intellectual corruption of the German people during the 1930s. He was a superb genocidist, very, very skilled, very organized, had a PhD in medieval English literature. Let's not forget that of the men who organized the Holocaust at Wannsee, there were, I think, a dozen men that sat around a table in Berlin and organized the execution of over 6 million Jews. Most of them had PhDs, so beware of anybody called doctor. But anyway, my point is that when he was asked later on in his life if he had any regrets, he said that his one regret was that he had been involved in the Holocaust, but then he stressed that all of those who had been deported from France, who he had arranged to be taken away from France, he then said that I had no idea that they were being sent to death camps, that they were being sent to Auschwitz. I removed them from France, but I had no idea where the trains were going, which I think has to be one of the great lies of the 20th century that was often repeated in other forms by others who served that most evil of regimes. Philip Jackson, after the war, became a very successful engineer. Toquette didn't remarry. She was haunted forever by the loss of her husband. Today, there's a bust of Sumner Jackson in the American Hospital in Paris. And you can walk along the Avenue Foch, and number 11 hasn't changed at all. It's the same black railings, the same facade. In fact, most of Avenue Foch hasn't changed at all. The French are very good at preserving in Paris their history, and even number 72, where this man you're looking at, where he resided, is almost exactly as it was back during the Second World War. So it's a place of great historical accuracy still, and a lot of ghosts reside there, and a lot of really amazing French people and Brits met their ends after they had been arrested and tortured and taken to the Avenue of Spies, which is Avenue Foch in World War II. So I won't carry on any longer. it's been a great pleasure to be with you. And if there's one moral that comes from my story, and in fact all three stories, I hope, it's that fascism needs to be stamped out wherever we see it, that the corruption of the bourgeoisie and of intellectuals throughout Europe was almost absolute in some places. Never trust the institutions or the elites to preserve democracy when they are being under threat of death, when they are being terrorized, when they face the ultimate price themselves. Individuals with enormous courage in France saved that country's conscience. The few people that risked their lives did so and therefore saved that country's reputation. Most just stood aside and did nothing. So the warning is, fight fascism, fight racism, never allow monsters like Donald Trump to obsess, to live in our heads ever again. Sorry to be political, but he came very close to the prototype American fascist, and that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we've all learned a lot of lessons tonight. You know, I study a lot of military history, and the protagonists in all of these stories are people these are names that we don't know. These are the unknown names on the home front and fighting in the resistance that are not necessarily in the history books. And I would like to thank Gwen and Tim and Alex for bringing these stories to light. Andrew, thank you for telling us your family story. And Andrew is going to be joining us later in July, where we're going to do a program with Andrew and a few friends of his. Peter Onoff is going to be joining us again. We've asked a few other folks. So that's going to be the end of July. I'm taking the next couple of weeks off from History Author Talks, but in April 27th, we go back to the 18th century, and we've got Mary Williams, who's going to tell us about her book, The Revolutionary War in the Adirondacks, and my friend Jack Kelly, who has just come out with a book called Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty. And being a Vermont boy, that story is near and dear to my heart. On May 4th, we have Holly Mayer, who has written a book called Congress's Own about the Canadian regiments in the American Revolution, and Mark Anderson, whose new book is called Down the Warpath to the Cedars. Then we jump ahead on May 11th to the Pacific War. We go to, we're going to hear from Joe Whalen, who's written a couple of books. One is called Midnight in the Pacific, and his newest book, Bloody Okinawa. And then from Mark Galeacco, who's written a book called Unconditional, the Japanese Surrender of World War II. So we've got a lot of history authors talking. I want to remind you all that our guests' books that joined us tonight are all available wherever books are sold. Gwen Strauss's The Nine, Tim Brady's Three Ordinary Girls, Alex Kershaw's Avenue of Spies, and Andrew O'Shaughnessy's The Inimitable Freedom of the Human Mind is also available for pre-order right now. So I am pleased that you all joined us, and I thank you for your time, to both my speakers and to everybody in the audience who joined us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, Roger.
You bet.